I want to tell you a story about mounting a queue of human hair for an exhibit on racial discrimination that was part of the 2019 exhibition Skin, Living Armor, Evolving Identity, produced and presented at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. The show opened in the spring and ran for about 6 months. The first part of the exhibition was about the comparative biology of skin. It presented a diversity of animal skin types, functions, and products, including scales, feathers, and hair. The second part of the exhibition was devoted to topics related to human skin and skin color. The biology, physiology, and evolution of dark and light skin pigmentation in humans was presented, followed by a history of racial discrimination and the cultural evolution of racial identities in the Americas and in the US in particular. While curating this section of the show, our exhibit developer, Ryder Diaz, reached out to the Chinese Historical Society of America, a culturally specific history museum located in San Francisco's Chinatown, for ideas about what objects in their collection might help to tell the story of racial definition and discrimination with a local focus. Collection stewards at the CHSA suggested several objects. One of those was the queue. That is the subject of this talk. A 41-inch long braid of human hair interwoven with silk cords. It's more than 100 years old. A 19th century San Francisco law known as the Q Ordinance empowered law enforcement to cut off the long braided hair worn by Chinese men at the time. Because of this history, and because hair is a product of our skin, the Q was a natural choice for the exhibit. The exhibit production team, including the developer, designer, mount maker, and registrar, visited the CHSA to assess the Q, its physical and effective condition, and discuss mounting possibilities with CHSA staff. Together, we decided to mount the Q vertically. We wanted to show the braided hair in a position that would associate it with a real person, its former wearer. We felt that showing the Q in another position, stretched out horizontally, for example, or coiled up, as it was in its storage container, would not promote the same effect. With the mounting concept decided, the main challenge was then how to support and position the Q in the vertical position we chose. The plan: a removable mat to which the Q would be attached, and a separate wedge built into the case back to hold it. The mat would be secured to the wedge with adhesive backed hook and loop. I chose matte board for the facing panel because its surface qualities were similar to the matte painted interiors of the rest of the display cases. Its low profile would also allow us to get more tilt out of the shallow case. The attachment for the Q to the facing panel? Ribbons, cut from black crepeline, pulled through slots cut in the matte board. Crepeline, if you aren't familiar with it, is a very fine open weave silk fabric. There are 2 crepeline ribbons supporting the tassel in this photo close-up. Here's the materials list. And now, on to methods. I marked key features of the Q on folder stock and cleanly transferred this pattern to the matte board with pinpricks. A neat ribbon can be made from crepeline by cutting perfectly along the grain. It was efficient to pull a series of threads from the fabric and then cut the ribbons. I found it helpful to weigh down one or both sides of the fabric as I cut. An optivisor and tweezers were other pieces of indispensable equipment for working with this very fine fabric. After making slits in the mat to pass the ribbons through, I widened and then burnished the slits with a scalpel and dental pick. Then, I pushed the first end of the ribbons through the mat using folder stock. After positioning the Q on the mat according to the transfer marks, I brought the free end of the crepeline ribbon over the Q, shielding it with a paper scrap to avoid catching any hairs, and then used folder stock again to push the second end of the ribbon through to the back of the mat. I knotted the crepeline ribbons on the back and taped down the free ends to prevent movement and interference with the hook and loop. The tassel cords needed a little detailed positioning work with thread. With that done, the matted Q was ready to install in the case. Here is the wedge that will receive the mat. The bottom of the mat rested on a small metal lip shown by the arrow. On the right, the adhesive-backed Velcro is installed, and the wedge is ready. Once the cue was installed, I resolved a few unexpected position and support issues with stainless steel insect pins inserted into the mat. Now, the case was closed. The window, acrylic, was screwed into the case sides, sandwiched by face and backing frames. I gave a final wipe down to the front of the window, working from the top to the bottom. But what is this? At the bottom of the window, the silk cords are waving in time to my cleaning motion, and so are the hairs. My bare hand on the window had the same effect as the cleaning cloth you see in this video reconstruction. It turns out that hands in nylon are pretty good at imparting a negative charge to acrylic. The charged plastic, in turn, induces a charge imbalance in the silken hair, causing them to move. A triboelectric series, shown in black pen here, can help predict how materials may transfer charge when brought into contact. After testing a sample of Optium acrylic, which is made to have anti-static properties, we purchased a replacement window made of it. This solved the problem. Our project manager, Andrea Mode, was very responsive and authorized the expenditure right away. In order to avoid further handling of the cue upon deinstallation, because some breakage and hair loss did occur when the cue was coiled and uncoiled, we decided to create a new container for it and return the cue to the CHSA still attached to its mount. This was also done because of the possibility that the cue might travel in a new edition of the show. I want to step back and tell another story about this process, which involves working conditions. The mount was made in the gallery during our object installation period over the course of 2 days, instead of the workspace where we mounted the rest of the show. That workspace wasn't clean or secure enough. We had a moth problem there, and we felt that our mitigation attempts weren't sufficient to care for the cue properly. Fortunately, the gallery did not have a prior history of moth infestation, though we took extra precautions anyway, and it did have extra security because of the rhinoceros horn that was in the show. And now to step back a bit further. Many of you probably experienced a pause in your normal day-to-day work this past year. The California Academy of Sciences shut down due to COVID on the evening of March 12th. While our typical hands-on work was suspended, we had the opportunity to put time and effort into professional, departmental, and institutional reflection and planning. In the course of this work, I became acquainted, for the first time, with the International Council of Museums Code of Ethics. Several sections deal with ethical standards for human remains. Here is my summary. Now, I know that some of my colleagues on the production team were acquainted with the ICOM standards prior to this episode, but I didn't hear about them during this project. Nevertheless, there seemed to be a consensus around our decisions. Looking back, I'm glad we paid extra attention to our work with the cue. However, it's easy for me to imagine any of these decisions being made differently for reasons of time and budget, or even if we'd had a project manager with different priorities. I hope you think that the work I've described here conforms to ethical standards for the exhibition of sensitive materials. And if not, I would love to hear why. Advocacy for ethical and professional standards can begin with any of us, if we are aware of what those standards are. How do you talk about standards where you work?